In the first half of the 20th century, 6 million African American men, women, and children left their homes in the rural South. It was known as the Great Migration. They were seeking a better life, one free of poverty and Jim Crow laws, where their humanity was not denied and their economic prospects were not limited, and their lives were not endangered. The North was a symbol of hope and prosperity. With the outbreak of World War I in Europe, northern factories and steel mills were hiring. At first, a trickle of families came north to New York, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Philadelphia, or Detroit. In the cities, African Americans were free from the harsh racial domination of the South, but the North was no promised land.
The Great Migration started during that same period with blacks relocating from the South and coming to the North. And they were coming to the North for jobs, for a better way of life. What you really found was people were happy to leave the South, but when they got to the North, they still ran into issues. And so all of those issues that any population would have had, relocating to an area that they were totally unfamiliar with, that was work for the Urban League.
African Americans were often restricted to the most menial and dangerous jobs and faced discrimination in housing. After World War I, black soldiers returned home from high expectations that their sacrifices would be rewarded with greater fairness and opportunity. Instead, they faced fierce competition for jobs and housing.
The Urban League of Greater Pittsburgh was founded in February 1918. And our first headquarters was in the Hill District. We really evolved as a result of the needs that those people had. Where are we going to live? What work are we going to have? How are we going to take care of our children? All of the necessities of life. So it was the services that any human being needs in order to survive versus civil rights at that time. So the Urban League evolved into a civil rights organization after a period.
White resentment boiled over and race riots erupted in cities across the country. The worst of the riots was in Chicago. After 13 days, over 500 people were injured and 38 were dead, 23 of them being African Americans. More than 1,000 African American families were burned out of their homes. But there was no going back.
Well, you know, the story of race relations in America begins with slavery in 1619 in the United States and continues even till today. We've gone through different phases of race relations, obviously slavery, and then the post-slavery Reconstruction era, and then the period of Jim Crow, and then the Civil Rights era. But it's always been marked by a sense of, on the part of many, many whites, of inferiority of African Americans or people of color. And that perception has characterized race relations in the United States, meaning in many cases that African Americans or people of color were regarded as second class and denied many opportunities that whites enjoyed.
When the country sank into the Great Depression, the migration slowed. This time they moved north and west to cities like Alameda in Richmond, California, and Portland, Oregon.
African Americans' newspapers and organizations worked to help the African Americans become settled in their new communities. They still faced discrimination, but their children were gaining new opportunities. Northern schools weren't without problems, but here they would have the chance to learn. Life's uncertainty would continue, but their eyes were on the future. The Great Migration had transformed the lives of hardworking African Americans, and they, in turn, had transformed American cities.
When you think about it, many of the same focuses that we have today were the focuses then. The lack of education, decent and affordable housing, a life-sustaining job, and how do you just provide for your family? So quality of life in general, it quite honestly is still very much like today. And so those were some of the challenges agricultural, occupational, just basic living.
For most of the 1900s, the majority of African American people were concentrated in either the rural South or a northern inner city. But by about 1970, more than half of the black population lived outside of the South, and 8 out of 10 African Americans lived in urban areas and inner suburbs. The city is a black man's land, declared Detroit radicals James and Grace Lee Boggs. America's metropolitan areas became the crucible of black life.
African Americans, by virtue of the Constitution and the civil rights laws of the 1960s, are considered full status Americans entitled to all the rights and privileges all other Americans, which means that we have equality in terms of voting and often in terms of office holding, in terms of right to housing. All the other areas of life that are enjoyed by whites are enjoyed now by African Americans. That does not mean that we're totally free of racism in American society, but constitutionally and legally we are reached a status of equality.
For African Americans with education and a steady job, city life would be very attractive. Many recently desegregated jobs in government and education offered stable incomes. Even among black workers with little education, cities in the North and West offered higher incomes than in the rural South. In the 1970s alone, the purchasing power of the black Americans grew from $30 billion to $70 billion, and most of that money was earned and spent in metropolitan areas.
In each one of these things that I think are very successful statements, remember, we are coming from a position of, wow, who are these black people? Who are these people that are moving from the South to the North? And I will say it was a huge struggle then, and that huge struggle continues to the day. We have never been relaxed in our work.
The decade of the 1970s was one of political firsts and cultural rebirths. It began with the activist fervor of the anti-war and minority movement. Affirmative action bolstered enrollment at universities, while federal and city hiring provided black families with better job options. But as black mayors were elected, the debilitating impact of white flight kicked in. By the end of the decade, the African American middle class continued to expand, but others stayed trapped within cycles of poverty.
Racism is still alive and well in the United States, and I think it manifests itself more in terms of the structure, the institutionalized nature of racism, meaning that in many cases African Americans do not enjoy the same level of economic opportunity that whites enjoy in this country. For example, we know that the unemployment rate is greater among African Americans, or higher than it is among their white counterparts, and particularly among African American men.
Beginning in the 1970s into the 1980s, corporations eliminated 32 million industrial jobs, mostly in urban areas. The South Bronx lost 600,000 jobs. Detroit lost 250,000 jobs. Los Angeles more than 125,000. Each industrial job gone meant less money for local services and businesses and tax revenue. Mainly white city dwellers, but also middle-class African Americans with the resources, left for the suburbs or the South.
Well, I took over as president and CEO of the Urban League during what we call the period of deindustrialization of Western Pennsylvania. The factories and mills were closing, and so there was kind of a major economic transformation taking place in Pittsburgh, and it had its ripple effects upon the African American community. So we had to adjust to that reality and beginning to position African Americans for the new opportunities that would be emerging out of that transformation.
The 1980s were years of paradox. Enterprising women and men pursued advanced degrees and gained footholds in professional sectors. But many families lost access to services that kept children supervised and off the streets when the Reagan administration abandoned key social programs. The introduction of cheap drugs such as crack into black communities spawned violence and incarceration, with devastating consequences for black males in the black family. Messages in hip-hop communicated these urban woes and called for civic action.
One of the things that we had to face was dealing with unemployment, growing unemployment, and also the growing level of violence in our communities. And there is still, to some extent, the perception of the glass ceiling that African Americans have not reached the same level of equality in housing and in employment as whites have. However, we must confess that the fact that we've had now the first African American president, that's an indication that to some extent the racism has diminished.
As the 1990s rolled around, America saw a large influx of Caribbean and African immigrants. Black America grew more diverse and culturally, but still faced racial discrimination. With the international rise of hip-hop, Black performers in America commanded a world stage. Millions marched to protest police brutality and the social ills affecting their lives. Entertainers and activists tried to regain the political consciousness and soul power of previous generations by borrowing tactics popularized during the Civil Rights Movement.
In the 2000s, Americans would continue to face tumultuous times. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina and subsequent flooding devastated New Orleans and surrounding areas. Beginning in 2008, the crippling recession undercut the security of the poor and middle-class families nationwide. Home foreclosures hit Black Americans hard, yet the appeal of the country as a land of promise continued to attract an influx of Black immigrants.
Several reports here in Pittsburgh just in the past 12 months were published. What the African American community, what the white community thinks about living in Pittsburgh, thinks about making progress in Pittsburgh, it's a considerable difference. The African American community says living in Pittsburgh is okay, but it's the most livable city for whom? It was only 34% that thought it was okay. So that means the majority of Black folks working in Pittsburgh are extremely interested in us doing much better. And so there's opportunity there. And so the Urban League, yes, we want to take more advantage of these opportunities, and maybe because corporate America sees that they are short of employees, maybe we can do something to relax that racial tension, and there'll be more considerable and favorable outreach and training to the African American community.
The decade closed with the election of the nation's first African American president. Many felt we had reached a pivotal point, but as the years went on and social media usage began to increase exponentially, continuations of old problems began to surface once again. Police brutality has been all over social media sites such as Facebook and Twitter.
I think we have much more access to information today through social media. I'm not sure that it accelerates and emphasizes what is not true. I think the fact you have the media, newspapers, television, and obviously social media there to capture what they see and what they record, it would indicate that they're being fairly, I think, fair about racial issues in America.
My heart just gets filled whenever I think about the shootings that have happened, especially in the past couple of years. So the fact that we haven't embraced each other's culture to learn enough about one another, I can see how that legitimately puts fear and concern in a police officer. But I'm also very concerned about the lack of cultural understanding and the issue of racism that I do believe is honestly there for some officers. But moving us from where we are to where we need to be with police-community relations, I believe that deals with dialogue, understanding, and building trust.
These incidents have helped to spark a new movement in America called Black Lives Matter. With the election of Donald Trump as our new president, it leaves many minorities skeptical and fearful for the future. We as a nation need to be sure we hold our government accountable and ensure all Americans, regardless of race, sexual orientation, religion, gender, country of origin, mental and/or physical disabilities receive the same rights and privileges.
My hope is that young people, African American young people, and their white counterparts will work together in harmony and reconciliation and try to move forward what their ancestors and those who went before them tried to do in terms of opening up opportunities and increasing a much more civility and understanding between people of color and their white counterparts. So I think the younger generation, I think you have a responsibility just to continue to press forward and wherever you see racism is to resist it and to challenge it.
Remember that one person can make a difference. The internet is out there now, so you can go online and research anything that you want. You can come in and volunteer with organizations like the Urban League and others. So I will say to young people, anything that they're uncomfortable with, they should remember that man made that law or set up that circumstance. So he or she absolutely can make a change. One person can make a difference. So challenge the system within the law, but challenge the system.